I'm sitting down today with Kurt Schmoke, former mayor of Baltimore and now president of the University of Baltimore. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we're here today with the Harm Reduction Conference, and we'd like to ask you about your work on the issues of addiction treatment and drug policy. How did you first get involved in these issues?
Sure. Well, I was, prior to becoming mayor of the city, I was actually a prosecutor. I was a federal prosecutor, then I was the state's attorney, the chief prosecutor of the city. And so I was a traditional drug warrior, figuring that we could arrest and prosecute our way out of the problem. Then I had a friend of mine who was a police officer working undercover who was killed in the midst of an undercover drug operation. And I had to make a decision about whether to prosecute the person who killed, this is Officer Marcellus Ward, who killed him for the death penalty. And Marty Ward, when he was shot and killed, actually was wearing a body wire, so I had to listen over and over to the conversations. Bottom line is that that whole involvement in that convinced me that there were as many people out here who were hooked on drug money that were hooked on drugs. And so I felt that if we were going to, quote, win the war, that we had to come up with approaches that took the profit out of distributing drugs at the street level. That led me to look more and more at analogies between alcohol prohibition back in the 1920s, drug prohibition in the 1980s, and that convinced me that yes, we need the war on drugs, but it ought to be a public health war led by public health professionals rather than a criminal justice war. And so that's a long way of saying what led me to drug policy reform activity, but it was primarily the death of Officer Marty Ward and then the aftermath of considering all that was involved there.
And so that was really the experience you had as a prosecutor.
Right.
We're interested in thinking a little bit, as we brought together a lot of policymakers and academics and community members, and thinking about, in your tenure as mayor,
Right.
What were the experiences you had as a policy leader in dealing with the problems of addiction and drug-related violence?
Sure. Well, clearly, when I became mayor and I looked at our city, well, we've got a great city, but unfortunately, it was a tale of two cities. On one hand, we had some great wonderful activities, the best of urban America, and then 8 blocks away from the best was some of the worst. And a lot of that had to do, the worst aspects of the problem had to do with substance abuse and what, in my view, was kind of the three-pronged aspect. It was addiction, it was a crime associated with distributing drugs, and it was AIDS. And so what we had to do as a local government was to try to figure out ways to address the problems of AIDS and addiction and crime. And clearly two of the three of those are public health problems. And arguably all three are, but clearly two of the three of those prongs of the problem are public health problems. So again, that got us involved in thinking about public health approaches to AIDS and addiction.
And now, as we're really looking almost a decade later and seeing what's happened.
Well, almost 2 decades
I
now. But I appreciate it.
As you've seen the evolution in the city and in the city's government, thinking of the way that the city's Department of Health has come into the schools and has really started to focus more and more on these issues, maybe coming back to them, what do you see now needs to be done to address the problems of drug violence and drug addiction in the whole state?
Right. Well, I must say one of the reasons why I'm so pleased that the Bloomberg School is hosting a conference now on harm reduction is that I think that one of the things that really needs to be done is to explain to the public why the war on drugs has failed. I think there's a consensus out here that things aren't getting better, that we're not winning the war on drugs. but people don't understand why. Why aren't we winning? If we can help explain that and then say, here are some strategies that, if implemented, could lead to peace in the war on drugs, it'll be a huge success. So public education in its broadest sense is really an important step. And so we have to come up with evidence, we have to come up with the scientific rationale, and then show people how current strategies, why they're not working, and what the alternatives, the effective alternatives would be. So, an important step, but it's clearly our responsibility to come up with that evidence before we go out and try to persuade the public to make the change, because it's tough politically. I mean, most citizens, and thus their elected officials, believe that we can arrest and incarcerate our way out of this problem. And they're frustrated that we haven't.
Yeah.
So now we have to show not only why the current approach is bad, but what the alternatives are and how we might approach those alternatives.
You know, speaking about alternatives and thinking about how politically controversial the issue of harm reduction is specifically, but also how controversial drug policy is, and just getting airtime at all beyond what you were saying, you know, the arrest and incarcerate our way out of the problem. What do you think needs to be done in order to make meaningful progress in really de-escalating that political conversation so that we can have a more evidence-based discussion?
Well, because there's so much politics involved in this, I do think it's helpful now, and it's only in this context that I would say this, that we have a Republican governor who has demonstrated that he's open to consider new approaches to substance abuse. I think he could be an effective spokesperson in persuading the public, but of course we have to get in front of him with the evidence that shows that alternatives will work. So it's a process that won't occur overnight. But getting this evidence and having different voices represented, particularly in this conference where you have people from law enforcement, you have academics, you have the nonprofit sector, community-based groups, all of those together, if they can come up with the evidence and a consensus on alternatives, present it to the governor, get the governor's support for this, I think that we can make major changes in Maryland.
And one last question. Do you think that in your role as president of the University of Baltimore, that you can leverage the university's presence in the city and its work, you know, outside of the city to help make that sort of change happen? And how would you do that?
Sure. Well, one of the ways in which the University of Baltimore is helping, and I'm so glad that we are participant in this conference, we can actually look through all the existing laws of the state, which I think Professor Jaros from our law school has done. See exactly what the sentencing laws are, how they might be changed, look at some of the laws not only around the country but around the world that are having an effect on moving into an alternative drug policy, and thus present to a legislature specific legislation, not broad concepts, but actual legislative language. And I think that's the value of having a law school involved in this process, that they can get down to the particulars, because as one of our panelists said earlier, the devil is in the details.
Yes, sir.
So it's time for us to present details, evidence-based, scientifically based details.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Great, appreciate it.